Maybe I'm not good enough for presents. Those 7 words, whispered by a 9-year-old girl sitting alone on a freezing bench, brought a billionaire to his knees. But here's the twist that'll break your heart. 5 years earlier, that same billionaire had destroyed her father's job, crushed her neighborhood's hope, and stolen Christmas from hundreds of families. Now, standing outside that school fence in his $800 coat, David Harrison heard the cost of his greed in a child's voice. What he did next didn't just change her life. It changed everything. This is the story of how one forgotten little girl taught a powerful man what it really means to be rich. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll never look at success the same way again. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you about a man named David Harrison. He was the kind of rich you only see in movies. Real estate mogul. Penthouse in Manhattan. A car worth more than most people's houses. He built his fortune buying struggling properties, tearing them down, and putting up luxury apartments that most people could never afford. David had everything money could buy. But if I'm being honest, he had nothing that really mattered. One cold December afternoon, David found himself in the Bronx. He'd written a check to a struggling elementary school called Riverside. $20,000. Anonymous, of course. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to feel something. Anything. Like maybe he wasn't just a man who destroyed neighborhoods for profit. He stood outside the chain-link fence, watching kids play during recess. That's when he heard it. A small voice, so quiet he almost missed it. A little girl sitting alone on a bench, talking to herself. Maybe I'm not good enough for presents. David's heart stopped. Another kid walked by and laughed. Santa doesn't come to our neighborhood. We're too poor for Christmas magic. The little girl didn't argue. She just looked down at her worn-out shoes and whispered something else. David couldn't hear the words, but he felt them in his chest like a stone dropping into deep water. He'd grown up poor too. In a neighborhood just like this one. His mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He remembered being 7 years old, hearing neighbors say his family was too broke for miracles. He remembered the exact moment he stopped believing in magic. And he'd promised himself he'd never be that helpless again. But now, standing in his $800 coat, watching this child who already believed the world had forgotten her, David realized something. He'd spent 30 years running from poverty. And in the process, he'd become the very thing that crushed people like her. See, 5 years ago, David's company had bought the old Riverside textile factory. It employed 400 people from this neighborhood. He shut it down 2 weeks before Christmas. The numbers made sense on paper. But he'd never thought about the faces behind those numbers. Never thought about the kids who wouldn't get presents that year because their parents lost their jobs. Now, one of those kids was sitting on a cold bench, believing she wasn't good enough for Santa Claus. David couldn't move. The wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it. He just kept staring at that little girl. Something inside him, something he thought died years ago, started to crack open. He walked to the fence. "Excuse me," he called gently. The girl looked up, startled. Her name was Lily. He'd learn that later. She had dark brown eyes that looked way too old for a 9-year-old. "Yes, sir?" she said carefully, like she'd learned not to trust strangers. David knelt down so they were eye to eye. "I heard what you said. About Santa." Lily shrugged. "It's okay. I know he's busy with the rich kids." Those words hit him harder than any business deal gone wrong. He tried to smile. "What if Santa just got lost this year?" Lily gave him a sad little smile. "The kind no child should know how to fake. Santa never forgets the rich kids, mister." David had no answer. What could he say? She was right. That night, David sat alone in his study. Mahogany desk. Imported whiskey. A view of the city that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. On his desk was an old, faded photograph. Him as a boy, grinning with a second-hand toy truck. His mom smiling beside him even though she was exhausted. She'd made Christmas magical with $10 and hope. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. To his assistant. To a costume shop. By midnight, he had a plan. The next morning, Riverside Elementary woke up to something impossible. A bright red sleigh sat at the school entrance. Not a real one, but impressive enough that every kid pressed their face against the windows. A banner hung across the gate. "Santa didn't forget you." And then he appeared. David, dressed in the most perfect Santa suit money could buy, walked through the schoolyard with a massive bag of gifts. Each one wrapped carefully. Each one with a child's name written in gold. The kids surrounded him. confused at first, then delighted, screaming with joy. David found Lily standing by herself near the swings. He walked over and knelt down again. "Lily," he said, his voice warm. "I found your letter." Her eyes went wide. "But I didn't write one." "You did," he said softly, "even if it wasn't on paper." From his bag, he pulled out a wrapped box. Inside was a handmade doll. Brown skin, curly hair, wearing a red winter coat just like Lily's. It looked exactly like her. Lily held it like it was made of glass. Her lips trembled. "I didn't think Santa even knew I was real." David's voice cracked. "You're the reason he showed up." And in that moment, watching this little girl hug her doll and refuse to let go, David Harrison realized something. He'd been chasing success his whole life. But this, right here, was the first thing he'd done that actually mattered. By the end of the day, hot cocoa and cookies filled the cafeteria. Every kid from the neighborhood got a gift and a warm meal. Parents came with tears in their eyes. For one day, this forgotten neighborhood remembered what it felt like to be seen. But as David drove away that night, he knew one day wasn't enough. He'd given them Christmas. But what they really needed was hope. Real, lasting hope. And that was going to take a lot more than a Santa suit. David couldn't sleep that night. Or the night after. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face. That sad smile. That resignation. The belief that she wasn't good enough. He kept thinking about the old textile factory. The building still stood there, hollow and rusting. Windows broken. Walls covered in graffiti. A graveyard of what used to be. So one morning, David drove there. The gate was rusted open. He walked through the empty loading docks, his footsteps echoing off concrete. Inside, it was worse. Debris everywhere. Broken equipment. Old-time cards still scattered on the floor. He picked one up. The name read, James Murphy. Lily's father. David's chest tightened. He destroyed this man's life without ever knowing his name. He kept walking until he found the old locker room. Rows of rusted metal lockers, some with names still scratched into the paint. On one, he found it again. J. Murphy. And stuck to the bottom, faded and peeling, was a sticker. A cartoon Santa with the words, "Believe." David almost laughed. Instead, he just stood there in the cold, empty building and let himself feel it. All of it. The guilt. The regret. The weight of every decision he'd made that put profit over people. But guilt wasn't enough. Feeling bad didn't fix anything. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, Rebecca. She'd been with him for 15 years. Tough as nails and twice as smart. "I need you to pull every file we have on the Riverside neighborhood," he said. "David, what are you planning?" "Something big. Something that'll probably cost me everything." There was a pause. "Then I'm in." Over the next 2 weeks, David worked like a man possessed. He hired architects, city planners, community organizers. He met with former factory workers, including James, Lily's father. A quiet man with tired eyes and hands that still looked like they should be holding tools. "Why now?" James asked when David explained his idea. "Why do you suddenly care?" David didn't lie. "Because your daughter told me Santa forgot her. And I realized I was the one who took Christmas away from this neighborhood 5 years ago." James stared at him for a long moment. "So this is guilt money?" "No," David said. "This is me trying to do something right. Maybe for the first time in my life." The plan was simple but massive. Convert the old factory into a community center. Job training programs. Free childcare. A library. Classrooms. Gardens. And here's the part that made his lawyers nervous. It would be owned by the community. Not by him. Not by his company. By the people who lived here. He called it the Enough Project. But the moment word got out, the pushback started. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. Investors threatened to pull out. Business partners questioned his sanity. The city council wanted to know why a billionaire was suddenly interested in charity work. David sat through meeting after meeting, getting yelled at by people in expensive suits who only cared about profit margins. "This is financial suicide," one board member shouted. "You're throwing away millions." "I'm investing it," David said calmly. "In people. People don't give returns." David stood up. "Then maybe we've been measuring the wrong things." He walked out of that boardroom and never looked back. But the real fight came from somewhere he didn't expect. A city councilman named Richard Crane. Slick suit. Political smile. And a real estate portfolio that depended on keeping neighborhoods like Riverside poor so he could buy land cheap. Crane started filing complaints. Permit delays. Environmental reviews. Surprise inspections. Anything to slow David down. One afternoon, David got a call from Rebecca. They're trying to shut us down. Crane's pushing a city audit. Says we're violating zoning laws. David gripped the phone. Can he do that? He's already doing it. That night, David stood at the factory site, staring at the half-cleared debris. Workers had stopped. Equipment sat idle. The whole project frozen. He'd faced business rivals before. Hostile takeovers. Legal battles. But this felt different. This felt personal. James walked up beside him, hands in his pockets. They're scared of you. Scared. David shook his head. They're just protecting their money. No, James said. They're scared because you're showing people there's another way. That neighborhoods like ours don't have to stay broken. That scares the hell out of people who profit from keeping us down. David looked at him. So what do I do? James smiled for the first time. You fight, but not alone. The next week, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood fought back. Parents organized. Former factory workers showed up at city council meetings. Lily's teacher started a petition that got 5,000 signatures in 3 days. Local churches held rallies. Even the kids made posters and stood outside City Hall chanting. And the news cameras came. Local stations first, then national. The story spread. Billionaire who destroyed neighborhood tries to rebuild it. City tries to stop him. David gave one interview. Just one. And he didn't talk about himself. He talked about Lily. About kids who believed they weren't good enough for Christmas. About parents who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't pay rent. About a neighborhood that deserved better. This isn't charity, he said to the camera. This is justice. I took something from this community. I'm trying to give it back. 2 weeks later, the city council voted. 6-1 in favor of the project. Richard Crane was furious. But he'd lost. David stood outside the factory that evening, Rebecca beside him. We can start building again tomorrow, she said. No, David said quietly. We can start healing tomorrow. There's a difference. He looked at the building. Soon it would be filled with voices. Laughter. Hope. Kids like Lily learning they were enough. But first, he had to prove it was real. That this wasn't just another rich man's vanity project. He had to let the community lead. The morning construction restarted, something different happened. David showed up to the site at dawn like usual, but he wasn't alone. 50 people from the neighborhood stood there. Parents, teenagers, retired workers. They came with tools, work gloves, and determination. James stepped forward. We're here to help build. David was stunned. I can pay crews. We know, James interrupted. But this is our center. We should build it. And so they did. Over the next 6 months, the Riverside Community Center rose from the ruins of the old factory. Not just because of money or architects, but because of people. Neighbors painted murals on the walls. Kids designed the library. A retired teacher planned the classroom layout. A local chef helped build the kitchen for free meal programs. Every decision was made together. David learned to listen instead of lead. To ask instead of assume. To step back instead of control. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. One afternoon, during a community planning meeting, a woman named Gloria stood up. She was a single mother who used to work at the factory. I have an idea for a sewing workshop, she said nervously. Teaching people to make clothes. To start small businesses. David immediately started calculating costs. But before he could speak, James cut in. That's brilliant. Who else wants to help Gloria plan it? 5 hands went up. Just like that, the sewing workshop was born. Not because David approved it. Because the community created it. That's when David finally understood. This wasn't his project. It was theirs. He was just the one helping make it possible. The center started taking shape. Bright classrooms with big windows. A courtyard garden where kids could plant vegetables. A woodworking shop. A computer lab. A library filled with donated books. And in the main hall, a massive mural painted by the neighborhood kids. It showed hands reaching upward, holding stars. At the bottom, in Lily's careful handwriting, were the words, "We are enough." But not everyone was celebrating. Some people in the neighborhood were still skeptical. Too many broken promises over the years. Too many outsiders who showed up with big ideas and then disappeared. David understood. Trust isn't bought. It's earned. So he kept showing up. Every single day. Not in fancy suits, but in work boots and jeans. He learned how to swing a hammer. How to paint a straight line. How to listen to people's stories without trying to fix everything. One evening, A teenager named Carlos approached him. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked bluntly. "Rich people don't just help for no reason." David set down his paintbrush. "You're right. I'm not doing this for no reason. I'm doing it because I owe this neighborhood. And because a little girl taught me that some things matter more than money." Carlos studied him. "You mean Lily?" "Yeah, Lily." Carlos nodded slowly. "Okay, but if you disappear like everyone else, we'll remember." "I'm not going anywhere," David promised. And he meant it. As winter approached again, the center was almost finished. The grand opening was scheduled for the week before Christmas. Exactly 1 year after David first heard Lily's voice through that fence. But the night before the opening, David couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty building, his footsteps echoing in the halls. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The choices he'd made. The lives he'd affected. The man he used to be versus the man he was trying to become. He ended up in the main hall, standing in front of the mural. All those painted hands reaching for stars. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, it almost looked like they were moving. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" David turned. James stood in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep either?" David asked. James walked over, stood beside him. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. For this to be some kind of trick." "It's not a trick." "I know," James said quietly. "That's what scares me. Hope is dangerous when you've lived without it for so long." They stood in silence for a moment. Then James said, "You know what Lily told me yesterday? She said she wants to be a teacher when she grows up. So she can work here. In this building." David's throat tightened. 5 years ago," James continued, "I didn't think my kids had a future. The factory closed. I couldn't find work. We could barely eat. And I watched my daughter stop dreaming." He paused. "You did that to us." "I know. But now," James turned to face him, "she's dreaming again. They're all dreaming again. And yeah, you can't erase what happened. But maybe you can build something better on top of it." David nodded, unable to speak. James extended his hand. "Thank you. For showing up. For staying. For meaning it." David shook his hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like maybe he was doing something right. The next day, the grand opening filled the center with more people than the building could hold. Neighbors, families, reporters, even the mayor showed up. Music played. Kids ran through the halls. Parents cried happy tears. David stood at the back, watching. Not at the center of attention. Just another person in the crowd. Lily found him there. She was wearing a new coat. Her mom had saved up for it. And she carried the doll he'd given her a year ago. "Mr. David," she said, tugging his sleeve. "Come see the library." She grabbed his hand and pulled him through the crowd. The library was packed with kids picking out books. There was a reading corner with soft cushions. A computer area. A homework help station staffed by volunteer tutors. "This is where I'm going to study," Lily announced proudly. "So I can be a teacher." David knelt down to her level. "You're going to be an amazing teacher." "I know," she said with complete confidence. "Because now I know I'm enough." And there it was. The whole point of everything. Not the building. Not the programs. Not the money. It was this. A little girl who believed in herself again. That's what made it all worth it. The Riverside Community Center didn't just open. It came alive. Within 3 months, over 300 people were using it daily. Morning yoga classes for seniors. After-school tutoring for kids. Job training workshops in the afternoons. Evening English classes for immigrants. Weekend cooking lessons in the community kitchen. But the real magic wasn't in the programs. It was in what happened between them. People started gathering just to be together. Parents swapped recipes while waiting for their kids. Teenagers formed study groups that turned into friendships. Retired workers taught young people skills like carpentry and welding. The center became what David never could have planned, a home. Gloria's sewing workshop turned into a small business cooperative. 6 women now made clothes together and sold them at local markets. James started teaching a woodworking class where fathers and sons built furniture side by side. The community garden exploded with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that people shared freely. David watched it all from the sidelines, deliberately staying out of the spotlight. This was their success, not his. But challenges kept coming. Funding was tight. Donations slowed after the initial excitement. Utility bills piled up. Equipment broke down. The roof leaked during a spring storm. At a community board meeting, now run entirely by residents, people worried aloud. "We can't keep asking David to pay for everything," Gloria said. That defeats the whole purpose. She was right. The center needed to be self-sustaining. So they got creative. The sewing cooperative donated a portion of profits. James's woodworking class started taking custom orders. The community kitchen began hosting paid dinner events on Friday nights where local chefs showcased their talents. Kids started a car wash fundraiser. Slowly, steadily, the center found its footing. David contributed, but quietly. He matched every dollar they raised. Fixed things that broke. Connected them with grants and resources. But he never took over. He'd learned that lesson. One afternoon, Rebecca called him with news. The mayor wants to use Riverside as a model. He's asking if you'll help start similar centers in 3 other neighborhoods. David's first instinct was yes. But then he caught himself. Tell him to ask the Riverside Community Board. If they want to share what they've learned, I'll support them. But it's their decision. Rebecca smiled on the other end of the line. You've changed. I'm trying. The board voted yes. James and Gloria started traveling to other neighborhoods, sharing their story. Not as experts, but as neighbors who'd figured some things out. They talked about ownership, community decision-making, and building on people's strengths instead of their problems. The model spread. The Enough Project became a movement. But back in Riverside, something even more important was happening. The neighborhood itself was changing. Crime dropped. Not because of more police, but because people looked out for each other. High school graduation rates climbed. Small businesses opened. People who'd left came back. But the most telling sign was simpler. Kids played outside again. You could hear their laughter at the playground. See them riding bikes. Watch them walk to the center after school without fear. Hope, it turned out, was contagious. 1 year after the center opened, they held an anniversary celebration. The mayor came. News cameras returned. But the real guests of honor were the people of Riverside. Lily, now 10, stood on stage with a microphone. She'd grown taller, more confident. She'd written a speech herself. A long time ago, she said, her voice clear, I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought Santa forgot about kids like me. But then something changed. Not because someone rich saved us, but because we remembered we could save ourselves. She looked at David in the crowd. Mr. David helped. He showed up when we needed him. But you know what the best thing he did was? He stepped back and let us lead. Applause filled the room. This center isn't his gift to us, Lily continued. It's our gift to ourselves. And to every kid who needs to remember they're enough. David's eyes burned with tears. He caught James's eye across the room. James nodded, a small smile on his face. After the ceremony, David walked outside into the spring evening. The courtyard was filled with people laughing, eating, celebrating. Solar lights twinkled overhead. The mural glowed in the fading sunlight. Lily ran up to him, still clutching her speech notes. Did I do okay? You were perfect, David said. Mr. David, she asked. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why didn't you put your name on the building? David knelt down. Because it's not about me, Lily. It never was. This place belongs to you and everyone here. I just helped build the walls. You all brought it to life. Lily thought about that, then hugged him tightly. Thank you for listening to me that day. Thank you for teaching me, he whispered back. As night fell, David found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching families gather. Kids chasing each other. Parents talking. Teenagers hanging out. Old friends catching up. The simple, beautiful chaos of community. Rebecca joined him. You did good, boss. We did good, he corrected. All of us. She nodded. So what's next? David smiled. I don't know. And that's the point. This isn't my story to write anymore. It's theirs. In the distance, someone started playing music. People began dancing in the courtyard. Lily pulled her father into the circle, laughing as he spun her around. David watched them, his heart full in a way his bank account had never made it. He'd spent 30 years building an empire. And it took one little girl's broken heart to teach him what actually mattered. Not what you own, but what you give. Not what you control, but what you set free. And sometimes the richest thing you can do is step aside and let other people shine. 3 years later, David stood in his office, much smaller now than his old penthouse suite. He'd downsized, sold off properties, redirected his wealth. His company still existed, but it looked different. Instead of luxury developments, they built affordable housing. Instead of chasing maximum profit, they prioritized community benefit. His old business partners thought he'd lost his mind. His net worth had dropped significantly. But David slept better than he had in 20 years. On his desk sat a framed photo, not of a building or an award, of Lily and her classmates at their middle school graduation. She'd sent it to him with a note. "Because of you, I believed. Because we believed, we soared." His phone rang. It was James. "Hey David, got a minute?" "Always. What's up?" "Lily's starting high school next month. She got accepted into the honors program. Full scholarship." David's chest swelled with pride. "James, that's incredible." "There's more," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She wrote her entrance essay about the center, about learning she was enough, about wanting to be a teacher so she could help other kids believe in themselves." David had to set the phone down for a moment to compose himself. "You still there?" James asked. "Yeah," David managed. That's everything. That's exactly what this was all for." They talked a bit longer, then said goodbye. David sat back in his chair, looking out at the city. He thought about the journey. The moment he'd heard Lily's voice through that fence. The decision to change. The fight to make it real. The humility of learning to follow instead of lead. It hadn't been easy. He'd lost business relationships. Lost money. Lost the respect of people who only measured worth in dollars. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. Purpose. That evening, David returned to Riverside. He did this once a month now, just to check in. Not as the founder or the donor, but as a friend. The center was thriving. New programs had started. A music school, a youth employment agency, a health clinic. The model had spread to 12 other neighborhoods across the city. Each one adapted to their community's unique needs. Each one owned and led by the people who lived there. David walked through the main hall, nodding at familiar faces. The walls were covered with new murals, photos of community events, achievement certificates from residents who'd completed training programs. In the library, he found Lily, now 13, sitting at a table tutoring a younger kid with his math homework. She looked up and smiled when she saw David. "Hey, Mr. David." "Hey, Lily. Hard at work?" "Always," she grinned. "This is Marcus. He's struggling with fractions. But we're getting there, right, Marcus?" The little boy nodded enthusiastically. David watched them for a moment, his heart swelling. Lily, once the forgotten child, was now passing on hope to someone else. Later, David joined a community board meeting. He sat in the back, just listening. They were discussing plans to renovate the old corner store into a youth center. Residents were presenting ideas, debating approaches, voting on decisions. David didn't say a word. He didn't need to. This wasn't his meeting. It was theirs. After it ended, Gloria approached him. "You've been quiet tonight." "Just enjoying watching you all lead," he said honestly. She smiled. "You know, when you first showed up, I didn't trust you. I thought you were just another rich guy trying to feel good about himself." "I was," David admitted. "At first. But you stayed. You listened. You changed." She paused. "That's rare. Most people don't actually change." "I had good teachers," he said, gesturing around the room. As David left that night, he paused outside the center. The building glowed warmly in the darkness. Through the windows, he could see people inside, laughing, learning, living. This was his legacy. Not a building with his name on it, but a community that knew its own strength. He thought about something James had once told him. You can't save people, but you can remind them they were never broken in the first place. That's what the Enough Project was really about. Not rescue, but recognition. Seeing the worth in people that society had overlooked. Creating space for them to see it in themselves. David's phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "Thank you for showing up that day. You changed my life." He typed back. "You changed mine too." And it was true. Lily had saved him just as much as he'd helped her. Maybe more. Because here's what David learned in those 3 years. Being rich means nothing if you're not rich in purpose. Success means nothing if you succeed alone. And power means nothing if you don't use it to empower others. The greatest gift he'd ever given wasn't the building or the money. It was the belief that a forgotten neighborhood wasn't forgotten at all. That kids who thought they weren't enough were more than enough. That communities could heal themselves if someone just gave them the chance. As David drove home that night, he passed the old textile factory site, or what used to be the factory. Now it was the Riverside Community Center, glowing like a lighthouse in the darkness. He smiled to himself. 5 years ago, he'd torn down a factory and destroyed a community. 3 years ago, he'd helped them rebuild. But the real transformation wasn't the building. It was the belief. In second chances. In community. In the truth that every person, no matter where they're from or how much money they have, is inherently, completely, perfectly enough. And that belief, once planted, grows roots deeper than any foundation, spreads wider than any building, lasts longer than any fortune. That's the legacy David Harrison left behind. Not in steel and stone, but in hearts and minds. In a little girl who became a teacher. In a father who found purpose again. In a neighborhood that remembered its own strength. And every time a child in Riverside looks at that mural, at those painted hands reaching for stars, they remember, you are enough. You always were. You always will be. And sometimes that's the only miracle anyone needs. The end. If this story touched your heart, remember, there's a Riverside in every city. A lily in every classroom. An opportunity to show up, to listen, to help people remember their worth. The question isn't whether you have the resources. It's whether you have the courage to see people as they truly are, already enough, just waiting for someone to believe it.